All right, friends, we are here for week number 4 on the genius of Mark the Evangelist. This is an appreciation of Mark's gospel, which often is overshadowed in the New Testament by both Matthew and Luke, which are longer gospels, and then John, which is a different kind of gospel than the first 3 that are called synoptic gospels. Mark is often overlooked, but my point is that Mark, as the first of the Gospels, is the one that's the real innovation in the New Testament. Well, we've looked at the Gospel of Mark for the past 3 weeks, so I'm going to do a quick review of what we've done. Just want to end at the end of chapter 14 that we didn't quite do as much with as I wanted to last week. And then we're going to get into chapters 15 and 16, the end of the Gospel. I'm going to call this the crucified Messiah. And I do want to point out that the Gospel of Mark, contrary to what your Bibles might say, the Gospel of Mark ends with verse 8 of chapter 16. In some of your texts, it goes all the way to verse 20, but the section from 9 through 20 was a later addition to the Gospel of Mark. The earliest copies of Mark that we have, the earliest manuscripts, do not have that. It ends with verse 8, and I'll explain why that's an odd place to end, but why that is in fact the true ending of Mark. Okay, well, let's go back and review. I'll say more about that as we get to it. We talked last time about the structure of Mark. Mark has 2 portraits of Jesus. Jesus, the powerful Christ. After a short prologue, we have Jesus portrayed as the powerful Christ, where the vast majority of Jesus' miracles are concentrated, where he is able to silence his human and spiritual opposition with his powerful word and deed. He heals all kinds of people. And then we have a portrait in the second half, where we are leading up to and the suffering of we're leading up to the death of Jesus, which I call the suffering Christ. Starting in 831, Jesus is going to enter Jerusalem in chapter 11. But sorry, I keep hitting the wrong button here. He enters in Jerusalem in chapter 11, but 8, 9, and 10 is a preface to that final phase, and during that time he's going to give 3 passion predictions: 8:31, 9:31, 10:33, and 34. And every time I do this in class, and I say 8:31, 9:31, 10:33, and 34, students dutifully copy that down. And then when I ask them to write an essay on Mark, I always find that reference. Whether or not it answers the question that I've asked, or whatever, every single essay has 8:31, 9:31, 10:33, and 34. Well, 10:33 and 34 is the most detailed passion prediction. So we, the reader, know what's going to happen to Jesus when he goes to Jerusalem. Here is the passion prediction. It starts, see, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death. That's going to be the subject of chapter 14. Okay? Well, who are the chief priests and the scribes? We've talked about this before. Who are the chief priests and the scribes? They are the Sadducees. The Sadducees, not the Pharisees, the Sadducees. These are the leaders. They are the major voice on the Sanhedrin. Remember that. Then it's going to continue. The prediction is going to continue. Then they will hand him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him and spit upon him. Who are the Gentiles that are being talked about there? We're going to see who that is in just a moment. And after 3 days, he will rise again. There is the outline for exactly what's going to happen in chapters 11 through 15, and then into the beginning of chapter 16. Okay? Important information. So let's continue. Okay, let's continue. Here we go. Okay, we're going back to the high priest question. We saw at the end of chapter 14, at the end of class last time, And Jesus is before the Sanhedrin. This is after he's been arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. He is taken to the Sanhedrin, or the council, and they are trying to find a charge against him that will allow them to put him to death. And they can't find any because no two witnesses will agree. You need two witnesses that confirm each other's testimony to put someone to death in Jewish law. And they can't find that. So out of desperation, the high priest is going to ask, have you no answer? What is it that they testify against you? But Jesus was silent and did not answer. Again, the high priest asked him, are you the Messiah? Remember, that is the word, it's actually Christ in the text, Christos. Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? This is the first time those two terms, Christ and Son of God, have been used together outside of 1:1. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus the Christ, the Son of God. This is the first time those two are together, but the high priest does not say Son of God. He says Son of the Blessed One. Why does the high priest not say Son of God? Well, we talked about this last week, and I'm going to give you a brief Hebrew lesson and then a brief Greek lesson. This is back in Exodus chapter 3, where God reveals his personal name to Moses. Moses said to God, if I come to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your, I didn't change this, the God of your ancestor, what is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. And then you get down here a little footnote that is going to indicate I am what I am, or I will be what I will be. Then it goes on. The same word used here is used here. I am who I am. Thus you shall say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, thus you shall say to the Israelites, I am. Again. And now we're getting a third term for exactly the same word in Hebrew. And it tells you, with this little footnote, the word Lord, when spelled with capital letters, stands for the divine name, YHWH, which is here connected to the verb hayah, to be. Same name, same word, translated three different ways in these verses. Okay? I pointed out last time, YHWH is the personal name of God. It's 4 consonants. The Hebrew Bible is a consonantal text, was originally a consonantal text, so this is a YHWH. It reads from right to left. YHWH, and it's believed that this probably is Yahweh. Yahweh, you've heard that name. Okay? It comes from all Hebrew words come from a triliteral root. This probably comes from the verb to be, hayah. Hayah. And that's why it's translated literally, I am. Well, the Hebrew Bible was originally written, I always ask my students this, what language was the Hebrew Bible written in? And I get all kinds of really interesting answers. It's sort of like, who's buried in Grant's tomb? You know? What language is the Hebrew Bible written in? Well, they finally end up saying Hebrew. We finally get to that point. But the problem in the Hebrew Bible is that Exodus chapter 20, just 17 chapters after the passage I just read in Exodus 3, we are told in the Ten Commandments, you shall not make wrongful use of the name of YHWH, your God, for YHWH will not acquit anyone who misuses his name. Well, we are not told what it means to make wrongful use of or to misuse the name of God. So, Jews decide it would just be better to avoid misusing God's name to simply not pronounce it. And that becomes Jewish practice from this time on. Instead of reading Yahweh in the text, they read the word Adonai, which means Lord. which is why back in the footnote you saw back in Exodus chapter 3, it says when you see this little capital Lord in the text, you know that is the tetragrammaton, the 4 sacred letters that are the personal name of God. But I want to point out, Adonai is a title. It's not a name, it's a title. So this changes dramatically the meaning of the text. Well, the Hebrew Bible, originally written in Hebrew, as I indicated, we're going to find out that Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE is going to conquer the world. And then he's going to sit down and cry because there are no more worlds to conquer. He was age 23, I think, when that happened. And I keep thinking to myself, I didn't even have a job when I was 23. This guy has conquered the entire world. Anyhow, because of his influence in subsequent decades and in subsequent centuries, the language of the Eastern Mediterranean world became Greek. It was a different type of Greek. It wasn't classical Greek like Platonic Greek. This is called koine, or common Greek. And that's why the New Testament is written in Greek, because that's the language that was spoken and read in the Eastern Mediterranean world. Well, when they translate the Hebrew Bible, if everyone is reading your Hebrew Bible, but they don't understand Hebrew, they need a text in their own language. So the Hebrew Bible, starting in about the 3rd century BCE, gets translated into Greek. And when they do that, they come to the tetragrammaton. How are they going to translate it? What they're going to translate is in here, ego eimi. This is ego eimi, I am. Now, I want to point out that in Greek, you do not need to say ego eimi. You can simply say eimi as I am. This is really an emphatic form. Eimi would be sufficient. When you say ego eimi, that's a really strange way of saying I am in Greek. Okay? Eimi would do. Okay, let's go back. You got this? This is the name of God according to the Greek translation of the Hebrew tetragrammaton. Okay. Let's go back to Jesus' response to the high priest question. Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? What is Jesus going to respond? I am. Ego eimi. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. Ego. What is the response of the high priest to that statement? There's clearly a delay when I click and when we see what I want to see. Okay. The high priest tore his clothes and said, "Why do we still need witnesses? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your decision?" All of them condemned him as deserving death. Some began to spit on him, to blindfold him, to strike him, saying, "To prophesy." The guards also took him over and beat him. What has Jesus done by claiming that he is the Christ, the Son of God? He's committed blasphemy. Ego eimi. Why didn't Jesus want to admit who he was before? Because when he admits who he is, he ends up being put to death. He is the crucified Messiah. So now the messianic secret is exposed. Jesus has accepted his identity, and it's going to result in his death. Okay? So going back, let's go back to the 3rd passion prediction again and see what we're dealing with here. See, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes. They will condemn him to death. We've already seen this is what happens at the end of chapter 14. Notice he'll be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes. Who did we say those people were? Sadducees. Those are Sadducees. Then we're going to see in chapter 15, then they will hand him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him and spit upon him. Who are the Gentiles that Jesus will be handed over to?
The Romans.
This is going to be the Romans. Now, I want to point out something here. And this is important. Notice when it describes what is going to happen to Jesus, it does not attribute death to Jesus. The Gentiles will mock him and spit upon him. What it does not say is they'll kill him. The next statement is going to say, and after 3 days he will rise again, so we know he's dead. But notice how the author avoids saying Rome killed Jesus. I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. Go into that in more detail. So Jesus is now taken to Pilate. Taken to Pilate. As soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Notice it's not about blasphemy. He was charged with blasphemy before the Sanhedrin. And if he were guilty of blasphemy, Jews would have stoned him. That was the punishment for blasphemy. That's not the issue with Pilate. Pilate, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus answered him, "You say so." Then the chief priests accused him of many things. Pilate asked him again, "Have you no answer? See how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further reply, so that Pilate was amazed. I want to point out as we read this story, and this is a very, very, very common text, and it's going to be picked up by both Matthew and Luke. I want to point out how sympathetic a figure Pilate is portrayed as being. Pilate is going to do everything possible to get Jesus off the hook. And right away, Pilate's amazed. Jesus makes no further reply, and Pilate can't figure out what the problem is here. I want to make two historical facts abundantly clear. And if you remember nothing from any of the 4 lectures, these are the things you need to remember. Historical fact number 1, the Romans killed Jesus. Historical fact 2, some Jews may have had a hand in Jesus' demise. But this is not all Judaism. And the Romans are the ones who killed Jesus. How do I know that the Romans killed Jesus? Well, let's look at just the evidence that we have. First thing to point out is that all of the sources agree that Jesus was crucified. Jesus doesn't drink poison or doesn't do himself in or whatever. Jesus is crucified, and crucifixion is a Roman form of punishment. Jews never crucified. There's no indication that Jews ever crucified. The other thing to point out, though, it is consistent in all of the material that we have that Jesus is killed for being king of the Jews. King of the Jews is a Roman charge. It's a Roman charge, not a Jewish charge. This is exactly the title that is given to Herod the Great by Roman senatorial decree in 40 BCE. And the term Jew is a Roman term that is attached to people of Israel. The self-designation is not Jew. Paul doesn't call himself a Jew. Paul calls himself an Israelite or a Hebrew. Jew is a term that comes from the Roman world. Jew is by non-Jewish individuals, leveled at people of Judah. Jews would have used Hebrew or Israelite. So King of the Jews is a true Roman charge against Jesus. And a Messiah is, in fact, a kingly figure. And so, King of the Jews is, in fact, what the Messiah was supposed to be. A king of the Hebrew people. The Romans are the ones who killed Jesus. Now, having said that, it's really important for people to understand the historical context in which the Gospels were written. And it's important for you to understand that the early Christian community existed in a Roman Empire that was out to do it in. The Romans decided that religion was really divisive. And therefore, certain religions were going to be accepted as legitimate, and other religions would be accepted as illegitimate. Judaism was accepted as a legitimate religion, and so Jews were allowed to practice. Christianity was not a legitimate religion. And so Christians could be persecuted just because they were Christians. And we see that in the early Christian church. One of the things that the Gospels try to do is try to show that Christianity has never been a threat to Rome. And so you have numerous Roman officials who are going to talk about the innocence of Jesus and the innocence of the first followers of Jesus. This is in the Gospels, and you also see this in Acts as well. So Pilate is going to recognize that Jesus has done absolutely nothing wrong. The question is, how does a person who's done absolutely nothing wrong end up on a Roman cross? If Rome didn't think he did anything wrong, how does he end up on a Roman cross? Well, when you lessen Roman responsibility, you heighten Jewish responsibility. When in fact, historically speaking, the exact opposite is the case. Rome is far more responsible for Jesus' death than the Gospels let you believe. And the Jews are far less responsible than you might believe. So let's keep looking at the portrait of Pilate. Now at the festival, he used to release a prisoner for them. He used to release a prisoner for them, anyone whom they asked for. Now there was a man called Barabbas who was in prison with the rebels who had committed murder during the insurrection. So the crowd came and began to ask Pilate to do for them according to his custom. We have no indication outside of the Gospels that this ever happened, that Pilate ever let anyone go. And you have to understand that Passover is a pilgrim feast. People go to Jerusalem in the first century to celebrate Passover. And so, in fact, the city grows by 4 to 5 times its normal population. So it is a tinderbox for any kind of revolt. So the Romans are on guard when all of these people come from all over to celebrate the Passover. Okay? So here we have a story of Pilate saying, well, Barabbas was in prison with the rebels who committed murder during the insurrection. Here is a bad guy. Here is a revolutionary and one who's already guilty of murder. The crowd came to him and began to ask Pilate to do for them according to his custom. Pilate answered them, "Do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews?" This tree-hugging guy, I don't see anything wrong with him. Why don't I just release him? And he thought this would be the easy out. Well, he realized it was out of jealousy that the chief priests had handed him over. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release Barabbas for them instead. Now, again, I just want to point out this makes no sense in the context of the first century world. First century Jerusalem. How is this possible? You're going to, in this tinderbox world, you're going to release someone who is a radical, revolutionary, and a murderer, and you're going to execute instead someone who is a tree hugger, who really hasn't done anything. Okay? The chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release Barabbas for them instead. Again, who are the Jews involved in this? It's not all Jews, the chief priests. And what sect does the chief priest, what sect do the chief priests belong to? The Sadducees. These are Sadducees. But notice, by lessening Roman responsibility, you heighten Jewish responsibility. And so notice what happens. Pilate spoke to them again. Then what do you wish for me to do with the man you call the King of the Jews? They shouted, crucify him. Pilate asked him again, why? What evil has he done? But they shouted all the more, crucify him, crucify him. So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas for them. And after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified. What evil has he done? What evil has he done? Pilate has done everything to get Jesus off the hook, and he finally is manipulated by the crowds to release the revolutionary and execute the pacifist. That is simply historically inaccurate. Pilate and Rome are like that 500-pound canary. Where does a 500-pound canary sit? Anywhere the 500-pound canary wants to sit. That is Rome. Rome couldn't have cared less about Jews. It had no regard whatsoever for the people in Israel. It tolerated them because it was a legitimate religion, but it certainly didn't cater to their specific interests or needs. It did what it wanted to do. Jesus ended up on a Roman cross because Rome wanted Jesus dead. Not the Jews. Rome wanted Jesus dead. Now, there were some that may have helped get Jesus, may have helped in the arresting of Jesus and turning him over to the Roman authorities. But Rome killed Jesus. And that's really, really important for people to understand. You have to have the historical perspective in reading these narratives so that you can appreciate why, when you are Mark and Mark's community, you just don't go around charging this repressive regime with killing your founder. That's why in the third Passion prediction, it doesn't say that Rome killed Jesus, even though the reader certainly knows that Jesus was crucified. It doesn't even mention crucifixion in that Passion prediction. They're going to mock him and spit upon him, but they don't kill him, according to that. You don't go around and charge a repressive regime with that kind of behavior and expect to survive. It's much easier to blame the Jews, who are a powerless group at the time. Let's let them take the fall. But that doesn't explain how Jesus ends up on a Roman cross with the charge, King of the Jews. That's not the charge that the Sadducees came up with back in chapter 14. Well, I want to talk a little bit about crucifixion, and I simply want to point out that this is really graphic. And so if you're sensitive to this, know that this is going to be graphic, and you can either put your fingers in your ears and hum or do something if you want to avoid this. I preached on this one time in a church on crucifixion, and I had a person come up afterwards and just chide me to no extent for talking about the suffering that Jesus went through. And I thought to myself, I thought this was the basis of Christianity. I didn't realize I was being a heretic by talking about the death of Jesus. That seems to be pretty important. Well, we don't know. To be honest, the Gospels tell us precious little about crucifixion. One of the reasons for that is that everyone in the Roman Empire at the time would have known what crucifixion was. But we forgot. we have forgotten. And the result is that we don't know exactly how people were crucified in Israel. We don't know until about the 1960s. There was some archaeological evidence discovered in Israel that's given us a clearer picture of how crucifixions took place. So I'm going to do this and just give you an idea of what crucifixion is about. So here's just some basic crucifixion facts for your enjoyment. First of all, I indicated that crucifixion is a Roman form of punishment. Rome did not invent it, they did perfect it. They literally crucified thousands and thousands of people. The purpose, though, was not to kill. The purpose was to prolong death, and I'll explain how that is the case. But they wanted to get to the point where you would beg to be put out of your misery. It's important to point out only males were crucified. Women were not crucified. This is only a male thing, and it was only used for most serious crimes. Something like treason or revolt or something like that is what would be reserved. This is the kind of punishment that would be reserved for those crimes. The other thing is that it took place in very public places. This was called deterrence in the ancient world. If you see someone crucified, and these were often people crucified on the main road into town. And so as you walked into town, you passed people that were being crucified, and you would think twice about breaking the rules in that particular town. And that's what Rome loved to do. They loved to sort of flex their might by showing the number of people crucified in very, very public places, and what you would get if you messed with Rome. And so this was done in very public places, and the people were always stripped. You've seen pictures of Jesus being crucified and the like, and he always has this loincloth that is decorously placed, and it's not. You were stripped bare naked. You were hung up on a hook like a piece of meat. And it always began with a flogging. Crucifixion itself did not begin with putting someone on a cross. It began with a flogging. And we're told in the passage that I just read that Pilate flogged Jesus and then had him turned over to be crucified. So it begins with the flogging. And I've seen many, many Jesus movies, and I always am interested in the flogging scene, because what you see is that it's sort of glorified whipping. You know, you see someone gets whipped, and you see sort of these lipstick marks on the back. That's not flogging. Flogging was done with something called a cat o' nine tails. It's a device that has these strips, leather strips, bound together with a leather handle. And at the end of each of those strips was a ball in which were embedded pieces of metal or glass. Sometimes sharpened bone were used as well, but something really sharp. The victim was tied to a post, and then the centurion would be responsible for using the flogging, this device, the flagrum it was called, using that device on the back of the victim. And when you do it, the way a person is stripped, you would see very quickly that you are going to slice off just chunks of the shoulders, of the back, of the sides, the buttocks, the thighs. Sometimes it would even come around and get you in the front of the stomach. But you can see sometimes when people would use this flog, at least initially, it would stick in the flesh. And so you'd have to jerk it out until you sort of laid bare the back, and then it would sort of slice through even more. All of that could be deadly. I mean, if you really had a very vigorous centurion, the person could die on the post. But that was not the purpose. The purpose was to get the blood flowing. Because when you lose a lot of blood, your blood sugar drops and your ability to resist diminishes. So you become more pliant. You allow people to do things because you can't resist. Some people never made it past the post, But if you did, then you were supposed to carry the instrument of your death, the crossbar, to the site of execution. Now, you often see in Jesus movies where Jesus is dragging the whole cross through the town. He would not have done that. He would have had to carry the crossbar, which would be like a railroad tie put on your shoulders, and your arms would then be lashed to it, and you'd have to be paraded around a most circuitous route to get to the site of execution. Again, wearing the person out so that they can't resist what's going to happen when you get to the site of execution. Well, we find out a very important element from this particular story that comes after the flogging. After mocking him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. They compelled a passerby who was coming in from the country to carry his cross. It was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Right here, you know this is not common policy. Right here, you know that Jesus was beaten within an inch of his life. He couldn't carry the cross. He was so beaten up in the flogging that he had no strength whatsoever, and so someone else is going to have to carry the cross. That's also one of the reasons why Jesus will be on the cross a relatively short period of time. According to Mark, he's crucified at 9 in the morning. He's dead by 3. He's on the cross for no more than 6 hours. That's a really short period of time. If you were not flogged well, you in fact could survive on a cross for as much as 3 days. Jesus is there for a quarter of a day, so it gives you an indication of how seriously the flogging was. So they take him to the site of execution. He's required to carry his cross. They can't carry his cross, so Simon of Cyrene is going to carry it for him. Well, they get to the site of execution, and what they do would be to throw the prisoner down, and they need to attach the arms first, and then they're going to attach the legs. The upright would already be at the site of execution. So the upright, the crossbar is what's been carried, and you need to be attached to the crossbar first. The crossbar is going to be lifted up, and there would be a notch in the crossbar that would attach to the upright. So there is a hole here in the crossbar that's going to go up and slip down on the upright. Okay? But you first have to attach a person to the upright, to the crossbar. Well, one of the things that we found out with this archaeological excavation is that other prisoners, in fact, had been nailed to the cross. For years and years, it was believed that only Jesus was nailed. That was a special form of punishment. Actually, that was not the case. That others were. And we have this archaeological evidence of a man who was crucified in the first century world, and there is a nail in some of the bones of his body. And that gives us an idea of the position of him on a cross, and a better then sense of how people were crucified in Israel in the first century. Because notice what it gives us in terms of detail is, and they crucified him. In Greek, it's three words, kai stauroson auton, and they crucified him. Here it's 4 words, but there's no indication. There's no indication here of the pain, of the suffering. There's no indication of the blood and guts. There's no indication of the sweat and tears. There's no indication of the bugs that would fly around you and your inability to bat them away. None of that is a part of the narrative. None of it. And they crucified him. Well, how did they crucify him? Well, this is what we know. Oh, I'm sorry, here's the inscription. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. It doesn't say 9 o'clock in the morning, it's the 3rd hour. And you figure out according to hours of sunlight. So this would be the 3rd hour of sunlight, which would be 9 in the morning. 9 in the morning when they crucified him, the inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And with him they crucified 2 bandits, one on his right and one on his left. Now, I'm going to point out what I think is the shape of the cross. And notice that the inscription is, it doesn't say it in Mark's gospel, but other gospels are going to say, and they put this inscription over his head. And so that has given people the idea that the cross was what we think of as a cross. That's probably not the case. It's probably a T. And as I described it, the crossbar would come down over the upright and form a T. And so how could the charge be put over his head? Well, you could put it on a cord and you would put it over his head. So the charge is over his head, not above, but hanging sort of around his neck. Yes?
When you say T, you're saying capital T versus lowercase t?
Capital T versus low, yes, okay, yes, T, okay, yes. Okay, sorry. Too many alphabets in my mind, yes. Okay, yes. Well, here is sort of the standard, what we do, and we all have this vision of what crucifixion looks like because we've seen pictures of it, right? Well, these artists were every bit as clueless as everyone else is, and so you have sort of these standard pictures that become sort of whatever it thinks. And I love this picture, first of all, because Jesus is like 4 feet off the ground. You actually don't have to be high at all. You need to be 3 inches off there. As long as you can't touch the ground, it gets the thing accomplished. You don't need to be 4 feet in the air. And in fact, one of the things that's so frightening about crucifixion is that people were crucified at eye level. So when you walk into town and you see crucified people on each side of the road, you're not looking up in the sky at them. You're in fact looking at them eye to eye as they're dying. So that's one thing. You also see that Jesus is crucified through the hands. The nails are through the hands and through the tops of the feet. That's common understanding of how people were crucified. And this is more Roman Catholic. This is a Greek Orthodox picture of the crucifixion, and Jesus is standing on something here. And he's got nails in the tops of his feet here, and again, nails in his hand. Okay? That's not how crucifixion took place. You can't support your body weight with nails in your hands. And we know this because here is a picture, and this is hard to understand. I'll explain what this is in just a moment. Here is a bone, actually 2 bones, and a nail. The nail went through these bones and must have hit a knot, and so it bent. And when they pulled the person off the cross at some point, buried him, they couldn't get the nail out, so they just buried him with the nail. So here's the evidence that someone else was, in fact, nailed to a cross. Well, what are we looking at? My daughter happens to be a pathologist, a pediatric pathologist, so she's helped me with this. Here is a diagram of the foot, and what you're seeing over here is this picture right here. You're seeing the top here, and the nail going through in this direction through the heel bones. Not the top of the foot here. It's going in this direction through the heel bones. Well, why is that important? Well, that gives us an idea of, in fact, how people were crucified. Here is, this is another picture. Another picture, it's giving you a different, the other one was turned in this direction. This has been turned 90 degrees in this direction. Here we have a nail, but we also have a piece of acacia wood. And this is another misconception that people have. Nails weren't just driven through the flesh. A board was put down and a nail driven through the board and then through the flesh or the bone. And that's what happened. So a nail, a board through these heel bones comes out the other side and then bends, and that's why you can't get the nail out. That gives us then 2 possible positions for crucifixion. here's the capital T. Okay? So here is, again, notice these are through the wrist. We have also evidence that the nails were not through the hands, but through, we've got scratches on the radius and the ulna, which are the two bones in the forearm that form your wrist. So the nails weren't put in the hands here, they were driven in at this side. You put something over it and then a nail driven through there. So one would be put on one side and then you'd be stretched and the other arm would be secured over on this side. And again, this was not anything that would kill anyone. It couldn't have been pleasant to have a nail driven through your arm, your forearms like that, but that didn't kill you. It did immobilize you. It pins you to this flat board. Well, they would then lift the body and the crossbar up and put it down on this upright here, and then they needed to secure the feet. And the feet are secured in probably one of two ways. Either the lower body was twisted, and a nail driven this way, or over here, the ankles or the heels were sort of crossed and a single nail driven in this direction. Now, if you don't understand what the problem is here, all you need to do, and do this in the privacy of your home, is get in one of these positions up against a flat wall. And when you put yourself up against a flat wall and you twist your lower body like this, and you're flat, you realize really quickly what the problem is. You can't breathe. And the only way to breathe is to push up and push out. But to push up requires you to push down on your heels that are pretty tender and pull out on your wrists that are also really tender and rub your back on a rough cross that's also really tender. And so you can't get in this position or stay in this position for any length of time, so you end up collapsing. And then you can't breathe, so you got to push up and out, up and out, up and out. As I say, some people lasted for 3 days, and that would be in the brutal heat of the daytime. And at night it gets really cold. In deserts it gets really cold. No clothing whatsoever, no ability to bat anything away. Bugs and all kinds of stuff would be all over you. Nothing you could do would put you in a comfortable position. Everything hurt. And finally, if you couldn't take it any longer, you would cry out, "Put me out of my misery." And if you had a compassionate centurion, they would come along with a large club, probably heavier than a baseball bat, but something like a baseball bat, and they would break your lower legs. With a baseball bat, they would whack your lower legs, and if they break your lower legs, you can't push up. And if you can't push up, you can't breathe. And so you die of asphyxiation. As I say, Jesus lasted only 6 hours on the cross, 9 to 3. So it's clear that he was severely beaten in the scourging. But this is an incredibly inhumane way to die. But again, notice that none of those details are a part of the narrative. What I've told you, if you haven't heard me describe this before, may come to you as all new knowledge, because the narrative itself doesn't give us any of those details. What do we find out from the narrative? Here is the scene at the cross. What we see is that Jesus is going to die in the loneliest, crowded place on the face of the earth. Notice how at the beginning of the gospel, everyone was flocking to Jesus. Jesus was so popular, they were coming to him from all areas to see him, to be in his presence. Now they come to gawk at him. And none of his closest associates are present. The male disciples are all gone. They left at the end of chapter 14. There are only some women at a distance, and we'll see them in just a moment. Now we have only accusers around Jesus. So it's the mental anguish here, not the physical anguish of the cross that Mark is going to emphasize. Those who passed by derided him, shaking their heads and saying, "Aha, you who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests, along with the scribes, were also mocking him, saying among themselves, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, that is the Christ, the King of Israel, come down from the cross now, so that we may see and believe." And those who were crucified with him also taunted him. In Luke's later version of this, one of those criminals is going to ask Jesus to be with him in paradise. That's not the case in Mark's gospel. Both of those persons crucified taunt Jesus. And then Jesus is going to die, 3 p.m. When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, "Listen, he's calling for Elijah." And someone ran, filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down." And Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last. Jesus is misunderstood even in his death. He's not crying out for Elijah. He's crying out, my God, this is a reference to Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me?" Listen, he's calling for Elijah. He's misunderstood even in his death. And then look at this cruel act. Jesus has done nothing but help people. And now someone wants to prolong his life long enough to see if Elijah is going to come and save him. They're not interested in Jesus. They want one more magic trick. Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down. And then Jesus dies unceremoniously. Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last. 2 things are going to happen at the death of Jesus. Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last. 2 things happened. The curtain of the temple was torn in 2 from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly this man was God's son." Those 2 things are really important. Let's begin with the curtain of the temple. I'll give you just a quick picture here of the temple of Herod. Herod is the one who built this temple. Started in about 30 BCE. It was not completed at the time of its destruction in 70. But this is the temple that is referred to throughout the New Testament. This is Herod's temple. And Herod put the temple, which is this building here, he put that in this huge platform that is something like 30 football fields. And it's all flat. It's a remarkable architectural achievement because it's built in the mountains. And having a flat space of that size in the mountains is really quite remarkable. But on that platform, he put this tabernacle, the temple, and the innermost chamber of that temple was called the Holy of Holies. And there was a curtain that separated the outer sanctuary from the inner sanctum. And the inner sanctuary is where the Ark of the Covenant was supposed to be kept. That was the Holy of Holies. Only once a year, one person in the nation was allowed to enter the Holy of Holies. That was on Yom Kippur, which Jews celebrated recently. It's the Day of Atonement. It was the one day of the year that the high priest, the chief high priest, made a sacrifice out here at the altar, and then took that into the intersanctuary, the Holy of Holies, to make atonement for the nation of Israel. Okay? This is going to be destroyed in the year 70 by the Romans. The platform is going to remain, that big, huge, flat space. That's called Hakotel today. It's the Temple Mount. But that temple is going to be destroyed in 70, and since that time, lamb has not been eaten in the Passover meal of Jews. And it will not be eaten until the temple is rebuilt. So, nowadays, Passover is celebrated in your home. It's no longer a pilgrim feast. You don't go to Jerusalem to celebrate. Well, here is the temple in Jesus' day. This is looking at it now from a different direction. This is looking from west to east. Over here we have the Mount of Olives. This is the temple facing the Mount of Olives. Here's the Holy of Holies here. And here is this huge, huge platform on which the temple sits. I point out a point here. People want to know where the western wall or the Wailing Wall is. And here, this section of the wall here is the Wailing Wall, or the western wall. That is the holiest site in Judaism today. And it's holy because with the destruction of the temple in 70, Jews had been unwilling to go up on Hakotel for fear that they might step on the presence of God. They're not quite sure where the temple stood, and so just to be assured that they don't tread on God's presence, what they do is get as close to that site as possible. And that's why this wall, which is close to where the inner sanctuary would have been, the Holy of Holies would have been, is so significant in Judaism today. And you see that if you've been to Israel, you know about this area. Here is what was built on the site. This is called the Dome of the Rock. That is the third holiest site in Islam. That is believed to be on the site of the temple that was there in Herod's day. And here is the wall that is close to that site. So Jews gather at the wall here to pray and to put prayer requests in the cracks in those rocks. And so just to point out, here is the Dome of the Rock. That's a Muslim site. And then here is the Western Wall. This is the holiest site in Judaism. This is the third holiest site in Islam. And just down the road, just a few blocks away, is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is supposed to be where Jesus was both crucified and buried. So within a short walk, you can go to 3 of the holiest sites in 3 major religious traditions in the world today. Okay, I'm just going to show you another quick picture. Here is another picture of the wall with the Dome of the Rock in the background and all kinds of people that are gathered there. You actually can do a live cam. You can do a stream and see exactly what's happening at the wall at any time. Here is a picture of me looking. Here's the wall and the Dome of the Rock overlooking that area. And here is another picture of the wall. And I simply want to point out these stones were laid by the workers of King Herod the Great. King Herod the Great, who was around at the time of the birth of Jesus, according to the New Testament. We also know there were some women at the cross. There were also women looking on from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the Younger, Joses, and Salome. They used to follow him and provided for him when he was in Galilee. And there were many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem. So there are women at the cross. And I always want to point out women are the ones that bankrolled the ministry of Jesus. They used to follow him and provided for him when he was in Galilee. And the Gospels all agree that that is in fact the case. Those women are looking on from a distance, and because they see Jesus die, they're also going to know where Jesus is buried. So there is a request for the body of Jesus. When evening had come, since it was the day of preparation, that is the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea asks for the body. When Pilate learned from the centurion that Jesus was good and dead, he granted the body to Joseph, and Joseph ends up burying that body in his tomb. Joseph brought a linen cloth, taking it down for the body, wrapped it in a linen cloth, laid it in a tomb that had been hewn out of rock. He then rolled a stone against the door of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where the body was laid. So they know where it is, and so they are in fact going to be the ones who are going to visit the tomb first. And here we have a reconstruction of a tomb, a first century tomb. I'll show you an empty tomb and a stone that is rolled away. Here's a stone that would be rolled away. It's in a channel, and it would be rolled down and sealed. And the women were concerned about how are we going to get that stone away from the tomb if we want to prepare the body. Well, here's the end of Mark's gospel, and I know that we only have a couple minutes. I'm going to do this quickly. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so they might go and anoint him. They were concerned about who was going to roll away the stone from the entrance to the tomb. But when they look up, they saw that the stone, which was already large, had already been rolled away. So they entered the tomb. They entered the tomb. They said, "Do not be alarmed. There's someone sitting in there. It's an angel. Do not be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus Nazareth, who was crucified. He's been raised. He's not here. Look, this is the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he's going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." And here is the final verse of Mark's Gospel, 16:8. Come on, Mary. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. So the gospel ends after the women have been told to tell. They say nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And you can see why someone didn't like that.